The emergency session alarm echoed through the halls of the Galactic Council chambers on Nexus Prime. Ambassador Zeftar of the Vorthak Empire straightened his ceremonial robes as he walked quickly toward the council chamber. The alarm had sounded at 0300 Standard Galactic Time, which meant something very serious had happened. As he entered the massive circular chamber, Zeftar noticed the tension immediately. The usual pre-session chatter was absent. Instead, the representatives from over 200 species sat in uncomfortable silence. Their various forms of communication, clicks, chirps, telepathic hums, and translated speech, were all quiet. High Chancellor Morthek, a tall crystalline being from the ancient ethereal race, stood at the central podium. Her normally calm blue glow was flickering with orange stress patterns. Behind her, the massive viewing screen remained dark. Fellow representatives, Chancellor Morthek began, her voice carrying through the universal translators. We have received disturbing reports from the Outer Rim territories. Reports that, if true, represent a violation of the most fundamental laws of our alliance. Zeftar leaned forward. The Outer Rim was where the newer species lived, including the humans who had joined the Galactic Council only 50 standard years ago. Humans were still considered a young species by galactic standards, barely past their first attempts at faster-than-light travel when they were discovered. 3 days ago, the Chancellor continued, a military force attacked the human homeworld of Terra. The attack was swift, brutal, and appeared designed to cripple their defensive capabilities. A wave of shocked murmurs spread through the chamber. Attacking a council member's homeworld was unthinkable. It hadn't happened in over 1,000 years, not since the Great Peace Accord was signed. Ambassador Crixtal of the Hegemony Coalition stood up. His insectoid features clicked nervously. Chancellor, surely there must be some mistake. No civilized species would dare attack a council member's homeworld. The consequences would be severe beyond measure. That is what we all believed, Chancellor Morthek replied. However, we have received a formal complaint and evidence from the human delegation. I have called this emergency session to address these allegations. The chamber's main entrance opened with a soft hiss. Ambassador Sarah Chun walked in, followed by her small human delegation. Zeftar had worked with the humans on several trade agreements over the years. They were generally peaceful, preferring diplomacy and trade to military action. But something was different about Ambassador Chun today. She walked with a confidence that seemed almost predatory. Her usual diplomatic smile was absent, replaced by an expression Zeftar had never seen on a human face before. It was cold, calculating, and somehow terrifying. Ambassador Chun, Chancellor Morthek said formally, please present your case to the Council. Ambassador Chun approached the central podium. She placed a small data device on the interface panel, and the viewing screen behind her came to life. The images that appeared made several representatives gasp in shock. The screen showed orbital footage of Terra, the human homeworld. Beautiful blue oceans and green continents were marred by massive explosion craters. Cities that had stood for centuries were reduced to smoking ruins. Orbital defense platforms floated in pieces among the debris fields. 3 days ago, at 0847 Terra Standard Time, Ambassador Chun began, her voice steady but carrying an undertone that made Zeftar's skin crawl. A fleet of warships dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of our solar system. They ignored all communication attempts. They've bypassed our outer defense stations and launched a coordinated assault on Terra itself. The images on the screen shifted to show ground-level destruction. Hospitals, schools, and civilian districts have been targeted. The death toll numbers appearing on the screen were staggering. Millions of humans killed in the first wave alone. The attackers used weapons specifically designed to penetrate our shielding technology, Ambassador Chun continued. They knew our defensive capabilities intimately. This was not a random attack. This was planned, coordinated, and carried out by someone with detailed knowledge of human military systems. She paused and looked around the chamber. Someone in this room gave them that information. The silence that followed was deafening. Zeftar felt his breathing apparatus constrict. The implications were enormous. If a council member had provided intelligence for an attack on another member's homeworld, it would tear the alliance apart. Chancellor Morthek's glow shifted to deep purple, a sign of extreme distress. Ambassador Chun, these are very serious accusations. Do you have evidence to support your claims? I do. Ambassador Chun activated another file. The screen showed intercepted communications between the attacking fleet and what appeared to be a council member's diplomatic channels. The encryption patterns were clearly from one of the allied species. Representative Nal Thurek of the Dominion Collective stood abruptly. His massive frame towered over the other delegates. This proves nothing. Communication intercepts can be forged. The humans are clearly attempting to create division among the alliance. Ambassador Chun turned to look at the Dominion representative. For a moment, Zeftar thought he saw something flicker in her eyes, a brief flash of what looked like satisfaction. Representative Nal Thurek makes an interesting point, she said calmly. Communication intercepts can indeed be forged. However, we also recovered this. A new image appeared on the screen, the wreckage of one of the attacking ships. The hull design was clearly Dominion technology, with their characteristic curved armor plating and energy weapon ports. The chamber erupted in chaos. Representatives began speaking, clicking, and telepathically broadcasting all at once. Nal Thurek's four arms gestured wildly as he denied any involvement. This is clearly a human fabrication, he bellowed. Our ships would never engage in such barbaric tactics. Chancellor Morthek raised her crystalline hands, and a harmonic tone filled the chamber, calling for order. Please, representatives, maintain decorum. These accusations must be investigated properly. Ambassador Chun waited for the noise to subside before continuing. We understand the serious nature of these accusations. However, the evidence is clear. The Dominion Collective provided intelligence to unknown attackers and may have directly participated in the assault on Terra. She activated another file. This time, the screen showed what appeared to be a Dominion military base. Humans in combat gear were moving through the facility, clearly engaged in some kind of assault operation. This footage was taken 18 hours ago, Ambassador Chun said. Human forces have located and captured the staging base used to launch the attack on Terra. We found extensive evidence of Dominion involvement, including detailed intelligence files on our defensive systems and civilian population centers. Representative Nal Thurek's skin color shifted from its normal gray to a deep red, a sign of extreme agitation in his species. Even if this footage is authentic, it proves only that humans are engaging in unprovoked military action against Dominion facilities. This is an act of war. Ambassador Chun smiled for the first time since entering the chamber. It was not a pleasant expression. Representative Nal Thurek, I appreciate your concern about unprovoked military action. However, I should clarify something important. She paused, letting the tension build. The base we captured was not in Dominion territory. She activated a star map showing the location of the attack. The base was located in the Kepler 442 system, which, according to galactic law, is neutral space open to all council members for peaceful exploration and trade. That's impossible. Nal Thurek protested. The Dominion has no military installations in neutral space. You're correct, Ambassador Chun replied. According to the treaties signed by the Dominion Collective, you have no military installations in neutral space. Yet here we are. The implications hit the chamber like a physical blow. Not only had the Dominion potentially attacked a council member's homeworld, but they had also violated the neutrality agreements that formed the foundation of galactic peace. Chancellor Morthek's glow dimmed to barely visible levels, a sign of deep shock. Representative Nal Thurek, these allegations are extremely serious. The Dominion Collective must provide an immediate explanation. Nal Thurek looked around the chamber desperately. Zeftar could see that the other representatives were already beginning to distance themselves from the Dominion delegation. In galactic politics, being associated with treaty violations was often worse than the violations themselves. The collective was not informed of any military operations in neutral space, Thuric said, his voice losing its earlier confidence. If such operations occurred, they were undertaken by rogue elements without government authorization. Ambassador Chen's smile widened. Rogue elements? How interesting. Perhaps you could explain how these rogue elements acquired detailed intelligence on human defensive systems? Information that would only be available to Council members through our mandatory defense cooperation protocols. The chamber fell silent again. Every Council member was required to share basic defensive information to ensure mutual protection against external threats. If someone had used that information to plan an attack, it was the ultimate betrayal of the Alliance's trust. Furthermore, Ambassador Chun continued, perhaps you could explain how these rogue elements acquired 37 Dominion heavy cruisers, 45 destroyer-class vessels, and the materials to construct a fully operational military base. The numbers were staggering. The ships and resources required for such an operation would have cost billions of credits and required the approval of the highest levels of Dominion government. Representative Thuric was visibly sweating now, despite his species' typically excellent temperature control. I cannot explain these discrepancies without consulting with the collective leadership. Of course, Ambassador Chen said graciously. We understand that such consultations take time. However, I should inform the Council that humanity will not be waiting for those consultations to conclude before taking appropriate action. Chancellor Morthek's glow suddenly brightened with alarm. Ambassador Chun, the Galactic Council must handle this matter through proper diplomatic channels. Unilateral military action could destabilize the entire alliance. Ambassador Chun nodded respectfully. Chancellor, we have the utmost respect for the Council's authority. However, we also have a responsibility to protect our people. The attack on Terra was not just an assault on humanity, it was an attack on the principles that bind our alliance together. She activated another display showing real-time data streams. As we speak, human forces are investigating other sites connected to the staging base we captured. We have reason to believe this was not an isolated incident, but part of a larger operation targeting multiple Council members. The representatives began murmuring again. The idea that other species might also be under threat was terrifying. What do you mean, other Council members? Asked Ambassador Vexith of the Trade Federation, her tentacles curling with anxiety. The intelligence we recovered suggests that humanity was chosen as the first target specifically because we are one of the newer members of the Alliance, Ambassador Chen explained. The plan was to test new weapons and tactics on a species with limited galactic connections before moving on to more established members. She paused, looking around the chamber slowly. Every species in this room was on the target list. The silence that followed was absolute. Zeftar felt his heart racing as the implications sank in. If the humans were right, then the attack on Terra was just the beginning of a larger conspiracy to destabilize or destroy the Galactic Council. This is preposterous, Representative Thuric shouted, but his voice cracked with stress. The Dominion Collective would never engage in such activities. Ambassador Chen turned to face him directly. Representative Thuric, I notice you keep referring to the Dominion Collective as if it's separate from you personally. Are you saying you had no knowledge of these operations? Of course I had no knowledge. I am a diplomatic representative, not a military commander. Then, perhaps you could explain why your personal authorization codes were used to access the Council's defense database 17 times in the past 6 months? Ambassador Chen activated yet another display. Or why your diplomatic ship was detected in the Kepler 442 system just 2 weeks before the attack on Terra? The evidence was overwhelming. Thuric's personal involvement was becoming undeniable. But what shocked Zeftar even more was how prepared the humans were. They had evidence for everything, answers to every question, proof for every accusation. This level of preparation suggested they had known about the conspiracy long before the attack happened. But if that was true, why hadn't they warned the council? Why had they allowed the attack on their own homeworld to proceed? Unless the realization hit Zeftar like a physical blow. The humans hadn't tried to prevent the attack because they had wanted it to happen. They had used their own people as bait to draw their enemies into the open. He looked at Ambassador Chun with new understanding and a growing sense of fear. The humans weren't just seeking justice for an attack on their homeworld. They were systematically dismantling a conspiracy against the entire Galactic Council, and they were willing to sacrifice millions of their own people to do it. The question was, what else were they willing to sacrifice? As Representative Inel Thurek continued his desperate denials, Zeftar noticed something else about Ambassador Chun. Despite the horror of what had happened to her people, despite the massive loss of life on Terra, she showed no signs of grief or anger. She was calm, methodical, and completely focused on her presentation. It was the behavior of someone who had planned for this exact scenario. Chancellor Morthek called for a brief recess to allow the representatives to process the information presented. As the chamber began to empty, Zeftar made his way toward the human delegation. "Ambassador Chun," he said quietly, "might I have a word?" She turned to him with that same cold smile. "Of course, Ambassador Zeftar. What can I do for you?" "I'm trying to understand the timeline of these events," he said carefully. "The level of evidence you've presented suggests extensive preparation. How long have you known about this conspiracy?" Ambassador Chun studied him for a moment. "Ambassador Zeftar, you've always been a perceptive individual. Yes, we had suspicions about various activities for some time, but suspicions are not evidence. So you used the attack as an opportunity to gather that evidence." "We used the attack to save the Galactic Council," she replied simply. "The conspiracy against our alliance runs deeper than you might imagine. What you've seen today is just the beginning." Zeftar felt a chill run through his body. "How much deeper?" Ambassador Chun looked around the nearly empty chamber. "Deep enough that when this is over, the Galactic Council will look very different than it does today. Deep enough that some species currently sitting in this chamber will no longer be members of the Alliance. And humanity will be the ones making those decisions. Humanity will be the ones with enough evidence to prove which species can be trusted," she corrected. "The decisions will be made by the Council as a whole, based on facts rather than political convenience." She paused and looked directly into his eyes. "I hope, for your sake, and for your people's sake, that the Vorthak Empire's hands are clean in this matter." The threat was subtle, but unmistakable. The humans weren't just investigating the Dominion Collective. They were investigating everyone. As Ambassador Chun walked away, Zeftar remained standing in the empty chamber, trying to process what he had learned. The attack on Terra hadn't been a tragedy that caught the humans off guard. It had been a trap, carefully set and patiently waited for. The question now was, who else was about to fall into it? The emergency session resumed after a tense 2-hour recess. During the break, Zeftar had noticed several species delegations engaging in hurried conversations through encrypted channels. The atmosphere in the chamber had shifted from shock to fear, and fear was making everyone suspicious of their neighbors. Chancellor Morthek called the session to order, but before she could speak, Ambassador Chun stood up. "Chancellor, if I may address the Council before we continue?" "Of course, Ambassador Chun." Ambassador Chun walked to the central podium with the same predatory confidence she had displayed earlier. During the recess, several representatives approached my delegation with questions about the scope of our investigation. I believe it would be helpful to clarify a few points. She activated the main display screen. A new star map appeared, showing the locations of multiple systems throughout Council space. Red markers indicated sites of interest, and there were dozens of them. In the past 72 hours, human forces have conducted operations at 37 different locations, Ambassador Chun announced. "We have recovered evidence of a conspiracy that involves not just the Dominion Collective, but several other council members." The chamber erupted in nervous chatter. Representatives were looking at each other with open suspicion now. The red markers on the map were scattered across territories belonging to at least a dozen different species. However, Ambassador Chun continued, raising her voice to cut through the noise. I want to be absolutely clear about something. Humanity is not interested in destabilizing the Galactic Council. We are interested in saving it. She paused, letting her words sink in. The conspiracy we have uncovered was designed to systematically eliminate council members one by one, starting with the newest and weakest members and working toward the more established powers. The ultimate goal was the complete collapse of the Alliance and the establishment of a new galactic order under the control of a small group of species. A new image appeared on the screen, a document covered in various alien scripts. This is a planning document we recovered from the staging base. It outlines a 20-year plan for the gradual destruction of the Council through manufactured conflicts, economic warfare, and targeted military strikes. The implications were staggering. What had seemed like a simple attack on Terra was actually part of a decades-long plot to reshape the entire galaxy. The document names specific target species in order of elimination. Ambassador Chen continued. Humanity was target number 1. The Kepler Commonwealth was target number 2. The Aquatic Alliance was target 3. Representative Silandra of the Aquatic Alliance let out a bubbling sound of distress. Her water-filled environmental suit began to cloud with stress chemicals. What about the other targets? Asked Ambassador Keth Moore of the Kepler Commonwealth, his mechanical voice betraying unusual emotional subroutines. Ambassador Chen's expression became even more serious. Every species in this chamber was on the list, Chancellor Morthek. Some are marked for elimination, others for subjugation. Only 5 species were designated to survive the transition to the new galactic order. She didn't need to name them. The representatives began looking around the chamber, trying to identify which 5 species might be powerful enough to orchestrate such a massive conspiracy. This is impossible. Representative Valthek of the Synthesized Worlds protested. A conspiracy of this magnitude would require resources beyond the capability of any single species or even small alliance. You're absolutely correct, Ambassador Chen agreed, which is why the conspirators included the Dominion Collective, the Hegemony Coalition, the Iron Federation, the Crystal Empire, and... She paused dramatically. The Banking Guild. The silence that followed was even more complete than before. The Banking Guild controlled the majority of galactic commerce and had financial influence over virtually every council member. If they were involved in the conspiracy, they could have manipulated entire economies to support the operation. Representative Morgax of the Banking Guild, a slug-like being who rarely spoke in council sessions, slowly rose from his position. Ambassador Chun, the Banking Guild categorically denies any involvement in these alleged activities. We are a neutral financial institution. Of course you are, Ambassador Chen replied with that cold smile. Which is why it was so shocking to discover that the Guild has been funding black operations against council members for the past 15 years. She activated a new display showing financial records. These are transaction logs recovered from the staging base's data course. They show a pattern of payments from Guild accounts to military contractors, weapons manufacturers, and intelligence brokers. The total amount spent on operations targeting council members exceeds 400 billion credits. The numbers were astronomical. 400 billion credits could have funded entire planetary defense systems or fed billions of people for decades. Representative Morgax's eye stalks were twitching with what looked like panic. These records must be fabricated. The Guild's financial systems are completely secure. They were, Ambassador Chen agreed. Until 3 days ago, when human cyber warfare specialists gained access to your primary data centers. She displayed a new set of images showing human soldiers inside what appeared to be a massive computer facility. We found it interesting that the Banking Guild had established several data centers in neutral space, supposedly for backup purposes. It turns out these centers were actually being used to coordinate financial support for the conspiracy. This is an act of war against a neutral institution. Morgox protested. The Guild has protection agreements with multiple council members. The Guild had protection agreements, Ambassador Chen corrected. However, those agreements specifically excluded protection for illegal activities. Funding attacks against council members definitely qualifies as illegal. Chancellor Morthek's crystalline structure was flickering rapidly now, a sign of extreme distress. Ambassador Chun, the allegations you're making could tear apart the foundation of our alliance. Do you have irrefutable proof of these claims? Edo. Ambassador Chen activated yet another file. This time, the screen showed what appeared to be a recording of a high-level meeting. The figures in the recording were clearly representatives from the 5 species she had named. The recording showed them discussing the timeline for attacks on various council members, the distribution of territorial conquests after the alliance's collapse, and the establishment of a new governing structure. Most damning of all, they discussed the attack on Terra as a field test for weapons and tactics that would be used against larger targets. The chamber was dead silent as the recording played. When it ended, Ambassador Chen looked around at the assembled representatives. This recording was made 6 months ago at a secret facility in the Orion Nebula. The facility has since been destroyed, but not before we recovered extensive documentation of the conspiracy's operations. Representative N.A.L. Thurick tried one last desperate protest. Even if this recording is authentic, it proves only that certain individuals within our governments may have acted without authorization. It does not implicate entire species. You raise an interesting point, Ambassador Chen said, which is why we have also recovered communication logs showing that the conspiracy's orders were transmitted through official government channels using proper authorization codes. She displayed a communication tree showing the flow of orders from the 5 conspirator species to various military and intelligence assets. The paper trail was extensive and clearly showed government-level authorization for the attacks. Furthermore, Ambassador Chen continued, we have testimony from captured personnel confirming that the conspiracy had the full backing of the named government's leadership. A new image appeared, a Dominion military officer in human custody. The officer was clearly providing information to human interrogators. Commander Volteric here was in charge of the attack fleet that hit Terra. He has provided detailed information about the conspiracy's command structure and future plans. Representative N.L. Thurick's skin color had shifted to a sickly yellow. Commander Volteric was a trusted officer. If he has been compromised, he hasn't been compromised, Ambassador Chen interrupted. He has been offered a choice between cooperating with our investigation or facing trial for war crimes. He chose cooperation. The implications were clear. The humans weren't just gathering evidence. They were actively building legal cases against the conspirators. This wasn't just about punishment for the attack on Terra. It was about completely dismantling the conspiracy and holding everyone involved accountable. Chancellor Morthek stood up slowly. Ambassador Chun, these revelations are overwhelming. The Council needs time to process this information and determine appropriate responses. I understand completely, Ambassador Chen replied. However, I should inform the Council that time may be limited. She activated a real-time display showing fleet movements throughout galactic space. Our intelligence suggests that the conspirators are aware their plan has been compromised. Several of their fleets are currently moving toward neutral space, possibly preparing to flee Council territory entirely. What are you suggesting? Chancellor Morthek asked. I'm suggesting that if the Council wants to maintain its authority and credibility, it needs to act quickly to apprehend those responsible for these crimes. Once they reach neutral space or territory controlled by non-Council species, bringing them to justice will become much more difficult. Ambassador Chen paused and looked around the chamber. I'm also suggesting that certain species represented in this chamber may need to make some difficult decisions about their future relationship with the Alliance. The threat was clear. The conspirator species could either cooperate with the investigation and face justice through Council courts, or they could resist and face the consequences of human military action. Representative Krixtal of the Hegemony Coalition, who had been silent since the recording was played, finally stood up. What exactly is humanity proposing? Ambassador Chen's expression softened slightly, but her voice remained firm. We are proposing that the guilty parties be held accountable for their crimes, that reparations be made to the victims of their attacks, and that steps be taken to ensure this kind of conspiracy can never again threaten the peace of our alliance. And if the accused parties refuse to cooperate, then they will discover why attacking Terra was a very poor decision. For the first time since the session began, Ambassador Chen's diplomatic facade slipped slightly. For just a moment, Zeftar saw something in her eyes that made his blood freeze. It was the look of a predator that had been patient, had planned carefully, and was now ready to strike with overwhelming force. "How many ships do you have?" Representative Krixtal asked quietly. "Enough," Ambassador Chen replied simply. The chamber fell silent again as the representatives tried to process what they were hearing. The humans, the youngest and supposedly weakest member of the council, were essentially holding the entire alliance hostage until justice was served. But it wasn't really hostage-taking, Zeftar realized. It was law enforcement on a galactic scale. The humans had uncovered evidence of massive crimes against the alliance, and were demanding that the perpetrators face justice. The fact that they had the military power to enforce their demands just meant that justice would actually be served instead of being buried in diplomatic negotiations. Chancellor Morthek called for another recess to allow the representatives to consult with their home governments. As the chamber began to empty, Zeftar noticed that the delegations from the 5 accused species were huddled in intense discussions. Their body language suggested panic and desperation. The representatives from the victim species, on the other hand, were approaching the human delegation to express support and offer assistance. It was clear that the balance of power in the council had shifted dramatically in just a few hours. As Zeftar prepared to leave the chamber, Ambassador Chen approached him. "Ambassador Zeftar, I wanted to thank you for your questions earlier. They helped me clarify some important points for the other representatives. I was just trying to understand the situation," he replied carefully. "Of course, and I hope I've been able to provide that understanding." She paused. "I also hope that when this crisis is resolved, the Vorthak Empire will continue to be a valued member of the Alliance." The message was clear. The humans had investigated everyone, and the Vorthak Empire had passed their test. It was both a relief and a terrifying reminder of how thoroughly the humans had prepared for this moment. The Vorthak Empire has always supported justice and the rule of law, Zeftar said formally. "I know," Ambassador Chen replied, "which is why I wanted to give you advance notice of what's going to happen next." Zeftar felt his breathing apparatus constrict again. "What do you mean?" Ambassador Chen smiled, and for the first time since the session began, it looked genuinely friendly. "Ambassador Zeftar, you're about to witness the largest coordinated law enforcement operation in galactic history. I thought you might want to prepare your people for what they're going to see." Before he could ask what she meant, emergency alerts began sounding throughout the space station. The alerts indicated multiple fleet movements in nearby systems. Massive fleet movements that were appearing almost simultaneously across Council space. The human trap was springing shut, and it was larger than anyone had imagined. The emergency alerts continued to sound as representatives rushed back into the Council chamber. The main viewing screen now showed a real-time tactical display of the entire galaxy, with fleet positions updating continuously. What Zeftar saw made him question everything he thought he knew about human military capabilities. Red markers indicating human fleet positions were appearing simultaneously across hundreds of systems. Not just Council space, but neutral territories, contested regions, and even some areas that were supposedly controlled by hostile alien empires outside the Alliance. "By the ancient stars," whispered Ambassador Silandra through her translation device. "How many ships do they have?" Chancellor Morthek's crystalline form was barely glowing now. "Ambassador Chen, would you please explain what we are witnessing?" Ambassador Chen returned to the central podium, but her demeanor had changed completely. Gone was the diplomatic restraint. In its place was the confidence of a military commander who had just deployed overwhelming force. What you are witnessing, Chancellor, is Operation Reckoning. Over the past 3 days, humanity has deployed our entire deep space fleet to ensure that justice is served for the crimes committed against the Galactic Council. She gestured to the display. Each red marker represents a human battle group conducting law enforcement operations. We are currently in the process of apprehending war criminals, securing evidence, and dismantling the infrastructure that supported the conspiracy against our alliance. The scale was impossible. The markers showed at least 3,000 human vessels spread across the galaxy. For a species that had joined the Council only 50 years ago, such numbers should have been impossible to achieve. Representative Inel Thuric was staring at the display in horror. This is an invasion. You're attacking sovereign territory without authorization. On the contrary, Ambassador Chun replied calmly. We are operating under the authority of Galactic Security Statute 247, which grants Council members the right to pursue criminals across territorial boundaries when investigating crimes against the Alliance itself. She activated a legal document on the screen. This statute was actually proposed by the Dominion Collective 12 years ago, when you were concerned about pirates operating from neutral space. The irony was devastating. The Dominion had created the legal framework that now allowed humanity to pursue them across the galaxy. But Statute 247 requires Council approval for operations of this magnitude, protested Representative Crixtow. Actually, it doesn't, Ambassador Chin corrected. It requires Council notification, which I am providing now. Approval is only required for operations lasting longer than 30 days. She smiled that cold smile again. We don't expect this to take 30 days. Chancellor Morthek managed to brighten her glow slightly. Ambassador Chun, regardless of legal technicalities, the scale of this operation is unprecedented. How did humanity acquire the resources for such a massive fleet? An excellent question, Chancellor. Ambassador Chen activated a new display showing human industrial capacity over the past 50 years. When humanity joined the Council, we shared our basic technological capabilities and defensive resources as required by Alliance protocols. However, we were never asked to share our maximum production capacity. The numbers on the screen were staggering. Human shipbuilding capabilities were at least 20 times higher than what they had reported to the Council. Their actual fleet strength was closer to 10,000 vessels, not the few hundred that other species had assumed. For 50 years, we have been building ships and preparing for the day when we might need to defend the principles of the Alliance, Ambassador Chin continued. We hoped that day would never come. Unfortunately, certain species forced our hand. Zeftar was beginning to understand the true scope of what had happened. The humans hadn't just uncovered a conspiracy. They had been preparing for this exact scenario for decades. Every treaty they had signed, every diplomatic protocol they had agreed to had been carefully studied and prepared for. But how did you know? Asked Ambassador Vexith of the Trade Federation. How did you know there was a conspiracy at all? Ambassador Chin's expression became thoughtful. Ambassador Vexith, when a young species joins an established alliance, they often face certain challenges. Discrimination, economic pressure, political marginalization. We experienced all of these things. Most species accept these challenges as the natural order of things, she continued. We did not. We investigated every slight, every unfair trade deal, every diplomatic setback. What we discovered was a pattern of behavior designed to keep newer species weak and dependent. The implication hit the chamber like a physical blow. The conspiracy hadn't just been about destroying the Council. It had been about maintaining the existing power structure by keeping newer species from achieving real influence. The attack on Terra was inevitable, Ambassador Chin said. We simply prepared for it and used it as an opportunity to gather the evidence we needed to expose the entire operation. Representative Morgax of the Banking Guild had been silent since his earlier protests, but now he spoke up. Even if everything you say is true, The economic disruption caused by your operations will destabilize the entire galactic economy. Trade routes are being disrupted, commercial vessels are being detained, entire systems are under lockdown. You're absolutely right, Ambassador Chen agreed. The economic impact will be severe. However, we have taken steps to minimize the damage to innocent parties. A new display showed human vessels escorting merchant ships through contested areas and human financial institutions providing emergency credit to species affected by the operations. We are not interested in punishing the innocent for the crimes of the guilty, Ambassador Chen explained. However, we are also not interested in allowing economic concerns to prevent justice from being served. The tactical display updated again, showing that several of the conspirator species' fleets had attempted to flee toward the galactic rim. However, human forces had anticipated this move and were already in position to intercept them. As we speak, Ambassador Chen announced, Admiral Sarah Mitchell is accepting the surrender of the Hegemony Coalition's 7th Fleet. Admiral James Rodriguez has captured the Banking Guild's mercenary forces in the Vega system. Admiral Lisa Zhang is currently negotiating with the Iron Federation's fleet commanders for their peaceful surrender. The updates continue to roll in. One by one, the conspirator forces were being cornered and captured. The coordination required for such an operation was beyond anything the Council had ever seen. Chancellor Morthek called for order as representatives began shouting questions and demands. Ambassador Chun, what does humanity want? What are your terms for ending this operation? Ambassador Chun straightened and looked around the chamber slowly before answering. Our terms are simple, Chancellor. We want justice, accountability, and reforms to ensure this can never happen again. She activated a formal document on the screen. Specifically, we demand that all individuals involved in the conspiracy be arrested and tried for war crimes. We demand that the species whose governments authorize these attacks pay reparations to the victims. And we demand changes to council governance to prevent any small group of species from gaining enough power to threaten the alliance again. What kind of changes? Asked Ambassador Kethmore. Expanded representation for newer species, oversight of financial institutions with galactic influence, and mandatory sharing of actual military capabilities rather than minimum defensive requirements. The proposals were revolutionary. They would completely restructure the balance of power in the Council, giving newer species like humanity much greater influence, while restricting the ability of established powers to dominate the alliance. And if these demands are refused? Chancellor Morthek asked. Ambassador Chen's expression became deadly serious. Then humanity will withdraw from the Galactic Council and establish its own alliance with species that share our commitment to justice and equality. Given the evidence we have gathered, I believe many council members would choose to join us rather than remain in an alliance controlled by war criminals. The threat was clear. The humans weren't just demanding justice. They were offering an alternative to species that were dissatisfied with the current system. Given their demonstrated military and economic capabilities, such an alternative could quickly become more attractive than the existing council. Representative N.A.L. Thurrock made one final desperate attempt to resist. Even if you succeed in destroying our governments, you cannot control the entire galaxy with military force alone. Eventually, your fleet will have to return home. And when it does, you're absolutely right, Ambassador Chen interrupted. Military force alone is not a sustainable solution, which is why we have also been building something else. The display shifted to show not just human ships, but vessels from dozens of other species flying in formation with them. The ships bore the markings of species that have been victims of the conspiracy's economic warfare and political manipulation. Over the past 3 days, 47 council species have formally requested to join Operation Reckoning, Ambassador Chen announced. They have contributed ships, personnel, and resources to ensure that justice is served. The numbers on the screen were overwhelming. What had appeared to be a unilateral human operation was actually a coalition representing the majority of council members. Furthermore, Ambassador Chun continued, 18 species have formally requested to establish mutual defense pacts with humanity, regardless of how this crisis is resolved. It seems that our commitment to justice and equality has resonated with many of our fellow council members. Zeftar looked around the chamber and realized that the representatives from the smaller and newer species were nodding in agreement. The conspiracy had made enemies of far more species than it had intended to eliminate. Chancellor Morthek was silent for several long moments as she processed the implications. When she spoke, her voice carried a tone of finality. Representatives of the Dominion Collective, Hegemony Coalition, Iron Federation, Crystal Empire, and Banking Guild, you have heard the evidence against your governments and the demands for justice. How do you respond? One by one, the accused representatives stood to give their government's positions. Representative Nal Thurek was the first to speak. The Dominion Collective agrees to cooperate with council investigations and accept whatever punishment is deemed appropriate by a properly constituted tribunal. The surrender was complete and unconditional. The other conspirator species followed suit, each agreeing to cooperation and accountability rather than face the alternative of military defeat and total isolation. Chancellor Morthek turned to Ambassador Chun. The accused parties have agreed to your primary demands. Are you satisfied with this outcome? Ambassador Chun nodded. We are satisfied, Chancellor. However, I want to be clear about something. Humanity's commitment to justice and the rule of law is permanent. We will continue to monitor the Alliance for signs of corruption or conspiracy, and we will act again if necessary. She paused and looked directly at each of the surviving representatives. We hope that will not be necessary. We hope that today marks the beginning of a new era of true cooperation and mutual respect within the Galactic Council. The session was adjourned, but Zeftar remained in his seat as the chamber emptied. The transformation he had witnessed was almost impossible to comprehend. In less than 12 hours, humanity had gone from being one of the weakest members of the Council to being its de facto leader. But what impressed him most was how they had accomplished it. Not through conquest or intimidation, but through careful preparation, overwhelming evidence, and a commitment to justice that had inspired dozens of other species to join their cause. Ambassador Chen approached him as he prepared to leave. Ambassador Zeftar, I hope today's events haven't caused too much concern for the Vorthak Empire. On the contrary, Zeftar replied honestly. Today's events have given me great hope for the future of our alliance. He paused. Though I do have one question. How long have you been planning this? Ambassador Chun smiled, the first genuinely warm smile he had seen from her all day. Ambassador Zeftar, my grandfather was one of the first humans to make contact with the Galactic Council. He told me that someday humanity would have to choose between accepting injustice and fighting for what was right. He started building ships 50 years ago, didn't he? He started building ships 51 years ago, she corrected. The day after he returned from his first council session and realized how the alliance really worked. As Zeftar left the chamber, he reflected on what he had learned about humanity. They were patient, methodical, and absolutely committed to their principles. They had spent half a century preparing for a war they hoped would never come. But when it became necessary, they had executed their plans with devastating precision. The attack on Terra hadn't been a tragedy that caught them off guard. It had been the trigger they needed to reshape the galaxy according to their vision of justice and equality. And looking at the results, Zeftar had to admit that their vision was much better than what had existed before. The humans had kept their promise. They had saved the Galactic Council by destroying the corrupt power structure that had threatened to tear it apart. In the process, they had established themselves as the new moral authority of the Alliance. The question now was whether they would use that authority wisely. But, given everything he had witnessed, Zeftar was confident that they would. After all, a species willing to sacrifice millions of their own people to protect the principles of justice and equality was not likely to abandon those principles once they achieved power. The galaxy was in good hands.